Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm quite pleased to rise today to speak to this latest Budget Implementation Act by the government, and I've been listening closely to the debate. So I'd like to start just by offering some comments on the debate so far, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the bill. I had occasion to ask the Conservative leader just not that long ago here in the House why it is that when he talks about the problem of inflation that Canadians are experiencing, and we know they are, we're all experiencing it. You go into a grocery store and you see the raise in prices. We know that people are struggling to stay in their homes. We see it on the street in our communities. We see more and more people pitching tents in order to have a roof over their head, such as it is at night. And we hear stories, unfortunately, of cities focusing on clearing out encampments of people with nowhere to go instead of focusing their energy on trying to figure out how to create better homes that provide more warmth and support in a challenging winter. So we know, and we're hearing about it from our constituents. We're hearing about it from constituents, for instance, who are having to choose to cut pills or pay the rent. There's all sorts of ways in which this really difficult economic time is affecting Canadians. So the question for us here in Parliament is what to do about it. And certainly the Conservative leader has a lot of opinions about what to do about it. My question earlier was why, when he talks about inflation and he talks about the hardship that Canadians are experiencing, he doesn't make mention of whether it's in Canada, and there have been some credible studies here in Canada that say that price increases over and above the increase in cost for large corporations are responsible for 25% or more of the inflation that Canadians have experienced. So I want to be really clear. That's not price increases. There have been price increases where companies, and particularly we know a lot of small and medium-sized businesses in our communities, are experiencing higher costs, and they have to pass that on to their consumer. We know even with some big corporations, they're experiencing higher input costs, and some of that gets passed on to consumers. We're talking about price increases that go above and beyond that increase in cost that they're passing on to consumers. So it is no excuse to say that they're simply passing on those costs. They're not. That 25% or so of inflation that's attributable to price increases above the additional cost means that they're taking that home in profit. So when you look at the profits of oil and gas companies that increased by 1,000% from 2019 to 2021, as an example, those were not increases of passing on costs. Those were some of those increases that contributed to inflation by being additional price increases just for the purpose of paying higher dividends to corporate shareholders and bigger wages to corporate executives. So how do you pretend to be a leader that is serious about addressing the problem of inflation when you're completely silent about the corporate greed that is driving a quarter or more of that very inflation? I submit to you that it's not possible. It's not credible. And I'm proud to be part of an NDP caucus with an NDP leader that is willing to name that problem here in the House of Commons, to acknowledge that we will not have a solution to the inflation problem in Canada if big corporations continue to feel that they can increase prices with impunity, because that is a major driver of inflation and a major driver of hardship for Canadians. And I think it speaks to the electoral choices that Canadians have, because we have a Conservative opposition here who would frame themselves as an alternative to the Liberals. But actually, if you look at this blind spot, the corporate-controlled Conservatives aren't willing to acknowledge or don't see or whatever it is. So I won't speak to the question of intention here. I'll just say that it is a blind spot, whether it's willful or not. And what that means is that they, like the current government, will continue to be prone, if they were in government themselves, to saying that if we just trust the market to deal with these problems, those problems will go away, because they refuse to acknowledge the role that unbridled corporate greed is playing in creating the economic problem that Canadians are facing today. So one of the ways that that manifests with the current government is on housing, for example, where the real meat of their housing proposal in the fall was all about creating more room for the market to solve the housing crisis. And for Hansard, I want you to know, I use air quotes for that. Perhaps they can appear on the record. Because I don't really think that we are going to get market solutions to the housing crisis. I don't think that's a revelation. I don't think that's particularly controversial, because I know that the market, since the federal government in the mid-90s stepped away from producing non-market housing, the market has had 30 years to solve our housing problems. And instead of solving them, it's created a crisis that is accelerating and getting worse. So simply freeing up Crown land and handing it off to developers to do what they will is not going to solve the problem, because the same motive of corporate greed that has been driving this housing crisis for decades now, and that has become particularly acute in the last few years, nothing about that basic structure will have changed if we're still just expecting market players to solve this crisis. And we've heard, like we've heard at the Finance Committee, from home developers and financiers and real estate people, that the market isn't going to solve this problem. And that's not to say we don't need more market housing. It's not to say that there won't be more housing built by the market. Of course there will be. That's not where we need the attention of government, though. The attention of government has to be on the part that the market will not do and has not been doing. And that's on non-market housing. So to say that we want to see the government focus specifically on non-market housing isn't to discount the role of the market and market housing. It's just to say that the public policy attention of the government doesn't have to be there. In fact, the virtue of the market is supposed to be that government doesn't have to get involved. So let them do their thing, but let's have the attention and the investment focus of our federal government beyond addressing the very real problem of non-market housing that has been neglected for 30 years and absolutely must return in a significant way in order for us to solve the housing crisis. It's a problem with the current government, and it will be a problem with any future Conservative government, because they share the same blind spot. So, what are some of the other things that we can do if we acknowledge the role that corporate greed is playing? And that's where I think the NDP has played an important role in twisting the arm of this government to do some things, like a 2% share buyback fee, so that companies can't just go ahead and, for various kinds of maximization of profit strategies for their shareholders or for the corporation itself, buy back shares as a way of transferring wealth to their shareholders without paying any tax at all. It's of note, and this is something that New Democrats have been arguing for a long time, well before this Parliament, that this legislation creates the possibility of implementing a digital services tax, which means a tax on the revenue of large internet-based companies like Netflix and others who right now are paying no tax in Canada at all, which doesn't make sense. They're not paying any corporate tax on the revenue that they raise in Canada. They get to walk it all out of the country for free. That doesn't make sense, and it puts traditional broadcasters at a disadvantage, and we're seeing the effects that that's having on our media market and the ability to hire journalists and to pay them to do the work that they do, which is an important part, however much we may disagree sometimes with the way that news media outlets frame certain issues. Their work is nevertheless important to a well-functioning democracy, and the fact that their competitors haven't had to pay any tax at all does a disservice to not just to them, but to Canadians who rely on news content for the functioning of our democracy. We've been pushing this government, and have already in Bill C-56 and now again in the Budget Implementation Act, to make meaningful changes to the Competition Act that have that will allow for the Competition Bureau to play a greater and more effective role in ensuring that big corporations aren't using their market power and their market position to pull one over on Canadians, to make the economy less competitive, and to have those outsized excess price increases that I was talking about earlier that are a significant factor in driving inflation. Another thing that we can do is be willing to let corporations know that, to the extent that they want to invest in Canada and create jobs in Canada, particularly in the natural resources sector, that there's an expectation that they're going to create good union jobs here in Canada in order to do it. And that's why I'm very proud of the labor conditions that are attached to the investment tax credits. This legislation will implement those labor conditions so that companies that are investing with the use of this tax credit in clean technology, in carbon capture and storage, which I'm not actually that happy to hear about, because I don't think that that is the way that Canada should be. I don't think that's the basket we should be putting our eggs in when it comes to emissions reduction. It's technology that's not proven at scale. But this government is determined to move ahead, and we hear a lot of positive comments about carbon capture and storage from Conservatives as well. I think, again, it's another shared blind spot of these two parties, the Liberals and Conservatives. Nevertheless, if that investment is going to be taking place in Canada, I want it to create good union jobs. That's what I want. And I want companies to know that they have to be paying a prevailing wage of the collective agreements in the trade union sector. Because what that means is that those companies aren't going to come in competing on who can pay Canadians the least to do that work. They're going to come in and have to compete on the things that we want them to be competing on. How efficient is the technology? How efficient are they at building it? What are their production techniques? That's the way that they should be competing. That's what they should be. When they're earning a contract, it should be on that basis, not on the basis of how little they're prepared to pay their workers. And too often in Canada, we have accepted a situation where we're happy to have companies come in and compete on the cost of labor and have a competition about who can pay Canadians the least to do a job that deserves a fair wage and good benefits and a proper pension. So I'm very proud that with this legislation, we're going to be implementing for the first time ever conditions on an investment tax break that centers workers in the middle of it and that has an apprenticeship requirement, so that we're not going to be saying to employers that would hire apprentices, which sometimes can be challenging. I know, I've been an apprentice myself, and when you walk on the job site the first day, you don't know what you're doing. That's what an apprenticeship is like. It's meant to teach you that. That's not always a profit maximization strategy for the employer in the short term. I think in the long term, employers with foresight see the value of passing on that training and passing on that knowledge and creating a workforce that they can avail themselves of. But we know there are employers for whom that is not their strategy. They're short-term focused. They want to bring on the journey people. They want someone else to train apprentices, and then they want to poach them later. And these tax credits will say that we as a country value training the trades workforce of tomorrow, and that if you want a tax break on the investment, you have to be part of a culture of building that workforce and creating good jobs for Canadians, not just now today, but also into the future, and giving them the tools that they need in order to be able to do that. We saw a Conservative government in Ontario use bankruptcy laws to shut down a post-secondary education institution, something that my colleague from Timmins, James Spade, did a lot of work on, raising awareness about what was wrong with that and that it should never be done again. And New Democrats have spearheaded the effort to get that done. And in this budget bill, what we see is a provision that says that the bankruptcy and insolvency laws of Canada and the CCAA will not be able to be used again in the future to perpetrate that kind of nasty closure on a public institution. I'm very proud of the work that my colleagues have done on that, and it's something that I think ought to go forward. But I want to come back to the housing question because it's an important one. I said earlier that I thought really in the fall the Liberals' focus was on market solutions, and that's not where the focus of the government really needs to be, certainly not to the exclusion of working on non-market solutions. In this bill, what do we see? Well, the only thing that's really happening on the housing front is the creation of a new Department of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, just merging two departments that already exist. I mean, this is not what you do in the face of a crisis. It's not an administrative crisis. It's not that people aren't pushing enough paper. It's that there's not enough housing getting built. And changing the name of the department without prioritizing things like recapitalizing the co-investment fund, one of the few federal funds that's actually building non-market housing, it doesn't make sense to prioritize shuffling the words in the department name around over advancing that funding. And in the fall economic statement, I think shamefully, that recapitalization that was much touted by the government as their action on the urgent housing crisis was backloaded in the budget tables and won't be coming for another 2 years. Particularly when you consider that the territory of Nunavut alone has been asking on an urgent basis for $250 million to address the housing crisis that they're seeing and to meet the needs that as a territorial government they're being asked to respond to. We didn't see a mention in the fall economic statement, and there's nothing in the bill around the Kabalak Hydrolink, which is a project that will help deliver power into parts of Nunavut, and I would hope also be accompanied with some more broadband access as well, in order to set the stage for more economic development in parts of Nunavut, as well as to try and reduce the reliance in Nunavut on diesel in order to power communities, instead of being able to bring hydro up, or in the long term perhaps be able to produce enough electricity in a sustainable way that they can become a seller and bring in own source revenues to Inuit communities in Nunavut as well. So that's the kind of long-term infrastructure investment that would make a lot of sense, and we don't see. Another important investment would be to upgrade the Cambridge Bay Airport, which is an important hub for Nunavut. And those kinds of investments, when we talk about Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic, we know that the best way to enhance Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic is to invest in the people who live there, and to help them have the tools and resources that they need in order to be able to have a strong economy and to live in appropriate housing and to have access to the services that people rightly expect in the 21st century. Instead, the rumor that we've been faced with now for at least a month on Parliament Hill, a little longer if we go back into early December, is that the government is contemplating deep cuts at Indigenous Services Canada. We certainly want to know more about what the government is contemplating and the effects that it will have on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across the country. It's an area of significant concern for us, and something that is not addressed here, but we do expect to see addressed in the budget in terms of what the government's plan is and how we're going to ensure that Indigenous communities once again aren't left holding the bag when a government decides it wants to save money to continue on a culture of corporate tax cuts. And I want to just end by coming back to this question of the role that large corporations are playing in driving inflation. What we know now, a report from the PBO as recently as December of 2021 said that just 1% of Canada's population owns and controls 25% of all of the wealth of the country. And the bottom 40% of income earners in Canada share just 1% of all of the wealth that's produced in Canada. And you think about that, and that 25% number is 5% higher than it was at the turn of the century. Now, what's happened since the year 2000 is that the proportion of wealth controlled by the top 1% increased by that whole 5 percentage points. I don't mean it increased by 5%. I mean it went from 20% of overall wealth to 25% of overall wealth. In the same time, the corporate tax rate came down from 28% to just 15% today. So we talk about Canadians feeling the squeeze. We talk about the middle class being expected to pay more in taxes to make up for government spending. But the big hole in government revenue comes from the people in that 1% who are walking away with that much more of Canada's overall wealth than they used to, because they pay significantly less tax than they used to. And that's why when people wonder, why is it that government can't have a robust housing strategy? We used to be able to do it. We did it coming out of the war. Well, yeah, the marginal tax rate that the richest Canadians paid coming out of the war was way higher than it is today. The corporate tax rate was way higher than it is today. And those things provided the revenue to invest in the middle class that then became the foundation for economic prosperity that lasted for decades. And the reason that economic prosperity is drying up and the middle class is feeling the heat so much is because governments, successive governments of Liberal and Conservatives, have let the people at the top off from having to pay their fair share. And that's what's making the difference in Canada. The fact that the Conservative leader won't name it means he won't fix it, and that's what Canadians need to know heading into the next election.
Hear, 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 hear.
Question.